I'm Benjamin Broadbent, and this is a sermon prepared for March 29th, 2020, the fifth Sunday in the season of Lent. It's prepared in particular for the people of the community church of Sebastopol, but also for anybody else who finds their way to this video. The sermon is based on the gospel reading from John chapter 11, verses 1 through 45, and you may want to pause here and go back and watch the scripture reading that we've posted with this video in advance of this sermon. It's a long story, the story of Jesus and the raising of Lazarus. And yet I would like to zero in on what is sometimes called the shortest passage in all of Scripture. The briefest way to put it is, Jesus wept. Sometimes it's rendered as, Jesus began to weep. In the Greek, it is 3 words. But it is a very short phrase embedded in a rather long narrative. The narrative of Jesus making his way to Bethany, where his friends Mary and Martha and Lazarus live, and where he raises Lazarus from the dead. But right there in the middle of the narrative is that short phrase, Jesus wept. And I'd like to take a little bit of time just to meditate on what it means to say that Jesus wept. The word in Greek means to shed tears. It doesn't necessarily mean to cry out, but to pause and to weep. You can imagine Jesus sobbing at this moment in the story. Perhaps you can relate. I know the other night as I sat in my house for too many days in a row, and it dawned on me how much is going to be lost because of this experience of shelter in place. It turns out that my kids' camp experience is being canceled. My son's trip to the National Youth Event that he was looking forward to has been canceled. Track season, basketball season, a vacation that we were going to take with family in June have all been canceled. And I realized those are things you can't get back. I mean, you can look forward to another year and hopefully doing them again, but in some senses, these experiences that make up our lives are now lost forever. I talked to a few people this week, in fact, 3 sets of grandparents who are all expecting grandbabies. A few of them have been born as of this sermon, and a few, and one is we're still waiting for. But in those cases, those babies are being born, and those grandparents have to delay being able to see and smell and hold their brand new grandbabies. There's a lot of loss. There's a lot of tears. Tears knowing that there are people that we know and love that we look forward to seeing that we don't get to see right now. And so telephone calls and maybe FaceTime on your phone will have to suffice. I read a reflection by somebody earlier this week that said that the purpose of Jesus wept is to show Jesus' humanity. That Jesus himself is overwhelmed by emotion in the moment. That Jesus is one who cares about his friends. And it seems to me that part of being human is grieving. And it's interesting that when we grieve, we don't just grieve the thing in front of us that we lost. But whenever we grieve, it's as if we're tapping down into a deeper underground grief. The grief underneath all of our griefs. Have you ever been to a memorial service of somebody that you perhaps knew slightly, and you find yourself overwhelmed by grief, and you realize that in that moment you've opened up to also grieving someone that you lost many years ago? I'm preaching this sermon on the birthday of my maternal grandmother, who would have been 96 today, and she died a couple decades ago. But just thinking about that, I tap into that grief, and it opens me up to a whole kind of aquifer of grief that I feel in my life. And maybe when we do that, we're also tapping into a greater reservoir of human grief. So I think when Jesus weeps in that verse, John 11, verse 35. It is his humanity. He is tapping into that wellspring of grief that is our common humanity. It's important to understand where in the story this comes. John tells his gospel in a number of very long narratives. We've heard some of them already this Lenten season. The story of Nicodemus, the story of the woman at the well, the story of the man born blind, these kind of long narratives. I've heard it said that whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Jesus teaching parables as the centerpiece of his ministry, John has Jesus as almost a living parable, as somebody who is kind of directing the stories as they come out of and pour out of his life as he goes. And so here is a story in John 11 that Jesus seems to be directing the whole way. You see, he's under threat. He has just narrowly escaped being stoned to death by some people that are threatened by him. They feel like he's going to stir up too much trouble, and he is going to get the attention of the Roman authorities upon him and upon all of the people, and that the Romans are going to have enough of it, and they're going to crack down. So they decide, it's better to just get rid of this one guy than to let him stir things up and put the whole nation at risk. And so Jesus and his disciples, they essentially flee. They go back to where it all started. They go back to the very place, it says, where John did his baptizing. They go back to their home base. They go back to their safe place out there in the wilderness, away from all of the authorities. But it is there that Jesus receives the news that his friend Lazarus has died. And you got to wonder what he was thinking. Should I stay or should I go? Should I remain here where it's safe and kind of wait things out? Or shall I go? The text tells us that Jesus delayed. We don't know exactly why he delayed, but he uses the words. He says, I'm going to delay and we're going to go so that God's glory can be known. What could he be talking about? It's as if he's directing the story and the narrative and the meaning of the story all at once. But finally, they go. They go together as the disciples. They go back to Bethany. And first they encounter Martha. She says, if you'd come earlier, my brother would be alive, but he's died. And then Mary comes, and she seems upset. Look, if you had come earlier, my brother would not have died. And they are accompanied by the mourners that have come, family members, friends, but perhaps also some professional mourners who would have come to be there to mark the occasion of this tremendous loss. And it is in that moment that Jesus says, okay, well, where have you laid him? And they say, come and see. And it is with those words, come and see, that Jesus cannot hold it together any longer. It's as if when he is invited to come and see, he sees the reality of the situation. All of this mourning that is coming, and he is overwhelmed by it. It overcomes him. He has tapped into it, and now he is weeping himself. I wonder whether Jesus wept is a way not just of describing Jesus' humanity, but also Jesus' divinity. You see, the God that we claim Jesus embodies is not just any God. It is the God of Israel, Yahweh, the great I am. I will be who I will be. And that God is a curious God. Not a God like many of the other gods of the ancient world, not an apathetic God. That is, a God who doesn't feel. Neither a pathetic God who is just pure emotion. But Jesus is the embodiment of a pathos-filled God. A God who can't stand to remain aloof from the cares of the world. A God who does not live in a far-off dimension or cloud somewhere, but a God whose very nature is to be in relationship with the world which God so loves. And it is as if in this moment when this God is invited to come and see, come, God, and experience the grief that all of these people are experiencing. In that moment, it overwhelms Jesus. His humanity and his divinity in this moment of grief come together, and the heart of God breaks. I wonder if Jesus could have done what he did next if he hadn't first stopped to grieve. I know that something that I'm learning in this whole experience is that I am a whole kaleidoscope of emotions. And I have found that if I don't allow myself to feel the emotions that are coming up, they almost always come out as anger. Anger in the form of frustration, impatience, some resentment. And they almost always come out directed at those who are closest to me, namely my family. And so I've made it a practice to pause whenever I'm feeling angry or frustrated or impatient, to pause and to say, what is the feeling underneath this? And I found that it's a variety of feelings. There's sadness, there's worry, there's some exhaustion. And when I allow myself to feel these feelings, I just remind myself that these feelings will pass and that they need to be felt in order to be allowed to let go and not manifest themselves as anything else, like anger. So Jesus, in this moment, when Jesus weeps, it's as if he finally takes a moment to feel what he's actually feeling, because the truth is told, his friend whom he loved, and the text tells us 3 times that this is a friend whom he loved, his friend has died. And look what it's done to all of the other people that he cares about. To take time to feel what we're feeling, just like Jesus did. To take time to grieve what has been lost and that we cannot get back. This is when we come to that place where it's been said the eye with which we see God is the same eye with which God sees us, where we share that grief with God. We are not separated from God in our grief. We find communion with God in our grief. And in finding that communion, we can receive the promise of new life that is in this story. Because Jesus goes to the tomb, has them roll away the stone. When the stench overwhelms everybody, he finally says, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus comes out of that tomb. He breathes again. He has been returned to his friends. And in this, Jesus has shown not only that through him, God's power of new life is active in the world, but that Jesus himself is the resurrection. Jesus takes on this title himself. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. I am. What does it mean to say that the great I am grieves and weeps? I think it means that the great I am, whose name is spoken over us, who comes alongside us in our grieving, is also the source of our greatest hope. For we're just a couple weeks away from Easter. And the great hope is that in the midst of our grief and our death and our worry and our frustration and our anger, we grieve in hope. And it is the hope of resurrection. Not only resurrection on that great day, that great far-off day that we all long for, but resurrection here in the now, in the midst of this virus pandemic, in the midst of all of our fear. The resurrection is now. A foretaste of that great day of rejoicing, which we can be assured will surely come, but which we can taste even now. Even when Jesus weeps, even when we weep alongside him. I pray God's blessing of courage, as you weep and feel all the things that you are feeling. And I pray you also sense that resurrection hope, which is surely worth believing in, because it is our great assurance. God bless and keep you. Amen.